election, and there's a lot of information out there. Here are 3 things you need to know from the Bipartisan Policy Center. 1. There will be a surge in voting by mail, which is safe and secure. And 2. You likely won't know who won on election night, since it will take longer to count all the ballots and report the results. And finally, your usual polling site might be different to keep you and poll workers safe. Check out canivote.org if you're not sure where to go. By planning ahead and knowing what to expect, you can make sure your voice is heard at the ballot box.
On behalf of the Hierarch House Museum and the Bipartisan Policy Center, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for Once Upon an American Dream Integration. This is the final of our 3-part panel series exploring the stages of the immigrant experience in America. My name's Kim Bender, and I'm the Executive Director of the Hierarch House Museum in Washington, D.C. Our museum is located in the home of Christian Hierarch, who is D.C.'s most successful historic brewer, and he immigrated to the U.S. in 1866. We use Hierarch's legacy to explore the theme of the American dream and also help small local creative businesses through our incubator program. And when we first imagined this program, it was supposed to take place here in our conservatory and garden with beer. Unfortunately, we've had to redo how we do this program, but luckily, because of our awesome partnership with the Bipartisan Policy Center, we were able to quickly change formats to this digital program. During our first panel discussion in May, which explored the theme of migration, we showed a brief video that narrated Hierarch's migration to America after the Civil War to give us some historic perspective. And you can check that out on the Hierarch House Museum's YouTube channel, and we will also post it on today's live stream chat. In July, we discussed the rich and varying experiences of Black immigrants in America. Today's discussion will focus on how immigrants integrate into our communities. In other words, how do they become us? You can submit your questions for the panelists using the live chat function on YouTube and Facebook, or on Twitter, you can use the hashtag BPCLive or hashtag OnceUponAnAmericanDream, or follow along on social media at Hierarch House and at BPC_bipartisan. And now I'm really happy to introduce our amazing moderator, Teresa Cardinal Brown from the Bipartisan Policy Center. She is their Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy, and she has served as Director of Immigration and Border Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Associate Director of Business Immigration Advocacy at the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and worked in the immigration practices of large Washington, D.C.-based law firms. In 2005 and 2006, Teresa became a member and later director of the Immigration Legislation Task Force in the Department of Homeland Security Office of Policy. She then served as the first DHS Director of Canadian Affairs and subsequently as the first DHS attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa, continuing until she left government service in 2011. Now over to you, Teresa.
Thank you very much, Kim, and thank you so much to the Hierarch House Museum for our partnership on this series of events. I am so pleased to welcome you here this evening, and I'm very excited to introduce our guests for this discussion on immigrant integration in the United States, and I think we're going to have a great panel for you. So let me start with Tyler Unminder. Tyler is historian and professor in the Columbian College of Arts and Sciences at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. He specializes in 19th century American politics and the history of immigration and ethnicity in American life. His most recent book, City of Dreams, is a history of immigrant life in New York City from the early 1600s all the way to the present. He's also published another book in 2001 called 5 Points, a history of 19th century America's most famous immigrant slum in New York, and served as a historical consultant to Martin Scorsese for the making of the Gangs of New York. And he's currently writing a book tracing the lives of several thousand Irish famine immigrants who moved to New York City in the 1840s and 1850s. Thank you for being with us, Tyler. Jeff Alfaro. Thanks. Jeff Alfaro founded J Squared Naturals with his partner in 2016. An immigrant himself from the Philippines, Jeff first started making candles more than 17 years ago on the other side of the world in his family's kitchen in the Philippines. J Squared produces high-quality fragrance derived from all natural sources without any synthetics. They use 100% natural or naturally derived materials. And Jeff and J Squared have been part of Hyrick House Museum's program to promote local artists and artisans in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you.
And lastly, Rachel Parrish. Rachel is the executive director of Welcoming America, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that provides local communities with the roadmap and support they need to become more inclusive toward immigrants and all residents. Prior to Welcoming America, Rachel served as executive director of MCAEL, a community literacy coalition that strengthens and promotes adult literacy and English language learning. And she also served as regional director with the United Way of the National Capital Area here in Washington, D.C. Rachel, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Teresa.
So once again, before we get started, I'll remind you that following the panel discussion, we'll answer your questions. And so if you have a question, please enter your question in the live chat or comments on YouTube or Facebook. Please start your question with the letter Q so we can identify it easily. You can also tweet at us with the hashtag BPC Live or hashtag Once Upon American Dream. We'll collect those questions during the discussion and then we'll start getting to them at the end and try to answer them. So turning to the topic of today's panel, which is immigrant integration, I thought we'd start first with you, Tyler. You have studied immigrant groups from the 17th century through the 20th century, focusing on New York City. What have been some of the themes you've seen among various immigrant groups and how they come to integrate into the city and into America?
Well, one of the most important themes is that over time, most immigrant groups integrate or assimilate in pretty much the same ways. So one important distinction to make is between children and adults. So immigrants who arrive in the United States as children tend to integrate or assimilate pretty rapidly and thoroughly. And by the time they're adults, it's pretty hard to distinguish them often from native-born Americans. Those who immigrate as adults, on the other hand, usually have much more trouble assimilating in the ways that native-born Americans would like them to assimilate. And those things mean things such as no longer having an accent, no longer eating the foods of their native lands, things of that sort. And so that's one of the issues involved in your question, is kind of expectations, in a sense, between natives and the immigrants themselves. So a lot of immigrants will see themselves as being very much integrated into American society, while natives will not consider them to be integrated. Another interesting facet of your question is that, there's really only been one group in all of American history that has integrated in a way that you might call virtually seamless, and that's been immigrants from England. Immigrants from England have tended over time to fit into U.S. culture pretty rapidly and pretty easily. They are accepted by native-born Americans pretty readily and pretty quickly. But every other group has found that integration is both a long process and a fraught process in many senses. And that's even for immigrants who come from places where English is spoken, and that can be Ireland, that can be the Philippines, that can be India, lots of places. The ability to speak English, it turns out, is not really a huge part of the integration process. It's part, but not a huge part. And then I guess the final facet I would raise in terms of answering your question is that native-born Americans have always believed that immigrants don't assimilate or integrate enough into American society. And they've believed that about every immigrant group, again, other than English immigrants, who aren't a very big part of American immigration history. Other than English immigrants, Americans have always thought immigrants don't assimilate enough. They don't integrate enough. They don't become American enough in the views of native-born Americans, even though the immigrants themselves feel very much assimilated and can point to lots of ways in which they live their lives differently than they had in the past. Native-born Americans tend to have very high standards for what it means to be a quote-unquote true American, and they are often not as accepting of of immigrant assimilation or integration as immigrants feel they should be.
Thank you. Jeff, let's turn to you and let's find out about your immigrant story. When did you arrive to the United States and where? And did you feel like you were welcomed?
Sure. I immigrated back in 2003 from the Philippines, and I was with my mother when I came to the United States. So one of the biggest things for me was we didn't have a big family here in the United States. So trying to figure out how we can be part of the community was the biggest thing for me, especially for my mother who immigrated here when she was about almost 60 years old, and I was 20 years old. The way I speak right now is completely different when I came here. I'm literally like speechless in terms of how do I communicate properly, even just with my neighbor or people just being outside. It was very challenging because I am used to a culture that when we go out of the house, we would see people. And when I arrived in America and we lived in an apartment, I go outside, then there's no people. Everyone is inside the house. And I try to figure out in what ways I could be part of the neighborhood where I live and to start making friends. And that was one of the hardest things for me, feeling the isolation. I never felt like the support is not there. I am 1,000 miles away from home, and all of my support is in the Philippines in terms of friends and family. So now trying to figure out just getting support from a neighbor or just to get to know your neighbor is, I find it extremely challenging back then. So it's been 17 years now, and things have changed so much. My friends and family back home would say that you're very Americanized now in terms of how I speak and how I wear my clothes and how I handle myself in being in public. The way I communicate with them is completely different. Even my mentality has changed for this length of time. I think differently. My communication is completely different. I tend the very first 5 years of immigrating to the United States, I felt like I'm always translating everything from Tagalog, which is my native language, to English, and it would take a lot of time and to really figure out in terms of communication, to even just to say something in one sentence. It would take some time to even speak with a Native American. It's been I would say a rough road, but it took a lot of time for me to get where I am today.
Yeah, thank you. Rachel, let me turn to you now. I mean, I from your experience working with immigrant communities and new immigrant communities and the communities they settle in, is his experience of feeling that kind of dislocation unusual? And from your work, what do you think makes for a welcoming community, and why is it important that immigrants be welcomed?
Well, I want to answer those questions by way of coming back to something that Tyler, that came up in Tyler's comments, which was this idea of a true American. And I think one of the things that makes the United States such a special place is that we define, on our best days, we define true American as being not something defined by race or religion or even country of origin. And so this question about how you become an American is, I think, one that we're really wrestling with right now at this moment in history in this country. And I think, you heard some of that in the way that Jeff talked about his experience of navigating a new place. And I think that experience of trying to find your way is not a unique one. And what we've learned in the last decade of work at Welcoming America is that we can make that an easier process, particularly at a local level, where communities really come together, and also where what it means to be American is really defined. or to be an Atlantan or to be a Washingtonian. And I would say that at its core, what it means to be a welcoming community is to really ensure that that definition of American or Atlantan or Washingtonian isn't defined by race, religion, country of origin, identity, but really about what it means to be part of our democracy, to be able to show up as your full self, to be able to contribute, and really creating the conditions for everyone in this country, not just immigrants, to be able to participate, to be able to belong, and to call themselves an American.
Thank you. That's great. Tyler, I'm going to come back to you. A lot of your work has focused on New York City. And New York City, I think for most people around the world, is like the quintessential American immigrant city. More immigrants land there than probably just about anybody else from our history. Do you think New York is unique or someplace special in terms of how immigrant communities settled there and or the process of integration there? Or do you think there's lessons that New York has for the rest of the country?
Oh, I think New York definitely has lessons for the rest of the country. I wouldn't say it's unique exactly. It's, especially in the modern era, New York is not that much different than, say, Los Angeles or some of the other big immigrant gateway cities. The scale is just much, much bigger. The variety is a little bigger than the other big immigrant gateway cities. But overall, it's not that unique, I don't think. And so I think it has a lot of lessons that it can teach us. One is that, over time, native-born Americans are always skeptical, suspicious about the ability or desire of immigrants to integrate into American society. There's always been a belief that immigrants have an innate desire to stay apart. And I think when you talk to immigrants, you discover that that's not really the case. But nonetheless, there is this fear, and you find that fear in the 17th century just as much as you find it in the 21st century. And so New York's story in that way does teach us that, a lot of the fears that many Americans have about immigrants are really unwarranted. And then another thing I think it teaches us is that in every generation of immigrants, there have been groups that Americans thought, well, that group definitely can never integrate into American society. They will always be apart. And, back in the 18th century and 19th century, that was Catholics who were thought they couldn't possibly become true Americans because native-born Americans mostly saw the United States as by definition, a Protestant nation. And they thought Protestantism was what made the United States great, and therefore Catholics seemed to pose a threat. And then by the time you get to the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, then Jewish immigrants came to fill that role, and Chinese immigrants came to fill that role, and East Asian immigrants in general were the new groups that Americans said, well, all right, maybe we made a mistake about the Catholics. Maybe they can become real Americans, but then certainly these Jews or these Asians can't. And then generations later, the same thing is said about Latino immigrants, and the same thing nowadays is often said about Muslim immigrants. And so what I think New York story teaches us is all these groups that are said to be unassimilable, that have no interest or ability to integrate really can. And then I guess the last thing I would add is that one thing you find in New York story is that a lot of people, I think, don't realize is that those who immigrate as adults to the United States really don't assimilate as much as a lot of native-born Americans believe their own ancestors did. So a lot of Americans think, well, why don't today's immigrants assimilate like my grandparents did? And typically, they've got an idealized view of how much their forebears actually assimilated, and that in truth their ancestors didn't assimilate very much at all. And so most people who come to America as adults are going to retain a lot of their foreignness, in the sense that they're going to continue to eat the foods they ate before they got to America. They're going to continue to sing the songs they sang before they got to America. They're going to continue to play the games they played before they got to America. And so in some ways, our view about a lack of immigrant assimilation or integration today is based on mythologizing how much immigrants assimilated in the past.
Yeah. Rachel, I'm going to go to you next. I mean, Tyler's talked a little bit about this idea of integration and assimilation, maybe interchangeably. You talk about welcoming. Can you talk a little bit about these concepts and how you think, how you work through them with both the communities you work with and immigrants that are part of those communities?
Well, I think, and I mean, people use these terms to mean different things, but I think in general, the idea of assimilation implies that there is one dominant group, and if I am new arriving here, I go over and become just like you, which I think is in a lot of ways really un-American, and what has made this country such an enterprising place, such a culturally rich place, is the fact that we really, at the end of the day, invite something that looks more like what is typically called integration, which is that, I arrive here, I bring my cultures, that adds to the mix. If you were living here all your life, your culture adds to the mix, and we create something new from that. And so that process of change really it's a two-way street of adaptation. And from that comes this greater sense of we. And for me, the idea of welcoming is about recognizing that, and recognizing that when we create communities that are inclusive, it's not about making people constantly feel like they are the guest, but really inviting people who come here new to join with those who have been here all along, to co-create what the new looks like, to co-create what a community looks like. And the fact is that you can't create a community that is welcoming for new people arriving if people who have been living in the community all their lives also don't feel welcomed and have been historically excluded, as many Black, Indigenous people in America have been, from the rights and opportunities of full citizenship. So to truly create a welcoming society, we need to reckon with that. And so I've been using and thinking a lot about the idea of belonging. And really, immigration is just the inflection point for us to think as a collective about how we really finally create an American society where all of us really truly do belong. And again, I think that's the moment we're living through now. And the good news is that there are a lot of communities all over this country who are modeling that as positive role models, who are really thinking about, both at a policy level and also at a sort of cultural level, how do we really create that kind of inclusive environment that assures people that they really do belong, which is why I'm very excited, actually, that we are being hosted here by a museum, because I think our cultural institutions are one place where that narrative can be retold. And then I just lastly will say, I wrote down, Jeff, from your comments, I think really reflect the idea that whether we call it integration, belonging, whatever term we use, really happens at that neighbor to neighbor level. And it's about feeling like you are part of something and really have those social connections, which is how any of us go about the business of finding a job, finding opportunity, finding that sense of connection. And so it's really at that level that we need to be working.
Well, that's perfect, because I was just going to ask Jeff, first of all, where did you come to the United States first? Was it in Washington, D.C., or did you come to another city first?
I actually lived in Manassas, Virginia.
Okay.
That's where we actually lived when we immigrated in the United States, and have not left the area since then. So I've been here for 17 years.
17 years in the greater Washington, D.C. area. For those not from the Washington, D.C. area, Manassas is not far. It's in Virginia. It's about, well, depending on traffic, 35 to 45 minutes outside of the city. So tell us about that process. I mean, you talked about, your friends and family back in the Philippines look at you now and say, oh, you're so American. I imagine there's still folks here that say you're from somewhere else. But you talk about who helped you most when you arrived to sort of transition from feeling like you didn't know how to find neighbors and didn't know how to connect.
Sure.
Was it an organization, a person? How did you sort of start that process?
Sure. When we immigrated in America and lived in Manassas, Virginia, the area where we live, the neighborhood, as mentioned earlier, it was just impossible to find the right group of people to connect with. As if like I can't find anyone outside, and I felt like maybe I'm looking for wrong places. So the area where we live, there was a church across the street from where we lived, and I found out there is a Filipino American church that's in that church. So I basically decided that maybe I should join the church and be part of this small community so that I could learn a little bit more from my Filipino Americans that had been part of this church, and how to transition and how to even, where to begin, how to live here in United States without your extended families. So that's one of the biggest things that helped me. I was able to communicate even portions of my own native language. It feels just the comfort of it. I'm so far away from home that I am not able to speak that language anymore. And now I am here and I have to learn a new language, and I have to force myself to learn that, or else I won't be able to speak to anyone. So the church helped me a lot. I was able to do a lot of things. They helped me. They helped my mother, who is at almost 60 years old, never learned English her whole life, and suddenly she's able to communicate little by little because of the organization and the Filipino American at the church. So that it was a very it didn't it took us a long time. It took years to feel integrated, to feel welcome, and that I'm just talking about a group of a Filipino American. But what about if I'm outside of that church and being, surrounded by Americans? It's still completely different. For me, all I know is one thing. I have to force myself to learn the language, to learn English, to really force myself to learn more about what's like living here in the United States and what I should do, because I am not in the Philippines anymore. So there are so many changes that I have to make, and decisions that I have to make, and changes for myself also. Just my accent itself. It was so strong back then. People, they have to ask me so many times, "What did you say? Can you repeat what you say?" It was, it felt, it felt very sad and lonely, because you're trying so hard to say the word, and yet you have to repeat it 5 times in order for them to get it. Just that alone feels like, what do I need to do to change this? The way I speak, the sound and the accent that I am actually possessing that is so strong. I need to be part of this community, because I am not planning to go back home anytime soon. So with that said, I have decided to go back to school. And I felt like that was the only way to integrate, to learn more. And during that time, when I immigrated to the United States, I attended a 2 years in university in the Philippines, which is a Catholic school. And I found out that my school was basically has international credentials, which when I went to school here in the United States, they were able to credit some of those 2 years, so I can continue my schooling here. And that's what pushed me to, I need to continue my education here. I need to learn these things so that I could move on with my life and help myself to be part of the community.
Yeah. Tyler, listening to Jeff's story and having read your book, this idea of immigrants who find their own community to help them integrate is the story of New York and its neighborhoods, right? That, a lot of Americans look at that and say, oh, they're ghettoizing, they only want to be with their own people. But that is the mechanism by which immigrants integrate. Is that what you found?
Very definitely. So when immigrants typically come to the United States, they feel a great sense of disorientation, of loneliness, of sometimes regret. Sometimes they wonder, what have I done? I made a big mistake. And so um, in order to find their way in the new community, immigrants typically go to wherever they can find other people from the place they came from. So we just heard that with Jeff's church, and that's a very, very typical story. And so one of the ways you find those, other people from the same place you came from is to go to the neighborhood where they live. And so immigrants typically will set up enclaves. Sometimes, as in the case in New York, say, of Little Italy, or Klein Deutschland, or the Lower East Side, they're whole neighborhoods, or even sometimes collections of neighborhoods. On the other hand, sometimes they're just, a block or two of people living in a certain location. And so immigrants tend to look for that enclave. That's where they can find people who will help them find a job, where they'll help people help them find housing. They'll find ethnic restaurants where they can get the food they're used to and that they're homesick for. And so those are very much the places that immigrants start. But then, as you mentioned, there are also places that kind of provide a kind of entree to further assimilation, because it's through those communities that you'll find immigrants who've been in the United States longer, who maybe have made the transition from kind of the lower level jobs to the more remunerative jobs, and introduce them to native-born Americans who seek the work that they're doing or want to buy the goods that they're producing. And so as a result, those immigrant neighborhoods or enclaves help the immigrants get settled, help them acclimate, and then help introduce them to the greater community and enable them to integrate into that community.
Rachel, I want to bring you in because we've talked about sort of some of the well-known immigrant cities, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami. But you work with a lot of communities that maybe don't have such a long history of immigration. And how do you find, are immigrants able to find those people who came before them, those enclaves, or is it harder in some of those newer places for that community to develop? What's been your experience there?
Well, that makes me think of two things, Teresa. I mean, first of all, folks listening in may not be aware that between 1965, which is the last Immigration Act that was passed, and the present, the size of the immigrant population in this country roughly quadrupled. So we had this really fast growth of newcomers, and we had people going to places outside of the traditional gateways of New York and Chicago, to a lot of smaller communities that went through really rapid demographic change. A lot of places like Dallas, Texas, and Atlanta, Georgia, which now are home to some of the fastest growing immigrant communities. Whereas, I think places like New York and Chicago, still have work to do. They had some infrastructure there and some familiarity with that. Whereas for a lot of these places, that infrastructure didn't exist. And so part of the work of making all of this go well is really building that infrastructure, both within local government to, in a systematic way, reduce the barriers that people face to being full participants socially, civically, economically, but also really creating that culture, bringing people together as neighbors to create that greater sense of we at a community level. I'll also just say, I think, sometimes when we talk about these issues, we focus a lot on the player and not on the team or on the game. And what I mean by that is, I think about my own family. The picture that you see behind me is actually the arrival of my grandparents and my mother at Ellis Island in the late 1940s. My family is Jewish, and they came here. Just like you, Jeff, my grandmother went on to open a small business. That was a success story. And at the same time, in that same year, it would have been illegal for them to buy a home in the community that I live in now in the suburbs of DC because of restrictive covenants. And so a lot of the things that are barriers to immigrants and the broader community becoming one have to do with segregation and the kinds of policies that have been in place that really prevented communities from being one. So, part of the onus is on newcomers to find their way, but we as a society can make that wayfinding a lot easier. And also, I think, just really use that opportunity to think about how we build a community that can really overcome that legacy of segregation and racism, to really create that greater sense of we.
Yeah. Jeff, I want to come back to you because you have started a business. And I think that's one of the things that maybe a lot of immigrants think is achieving the American dream, is starting their own business and succeeding in America. Was that your American dream? Was that something you really were looking forward to do when you came here? Or is that something that just came about?
That's actually, I've been thinking about that question about the American dream. It's a very unique for me, and what that means. The business that I started about 4 years ago was not planned at all. After achieving my undergrad in business, I felt like I was still struggling to find a job that I need. Just to even be part of the community was extremely hard. I have faced during my employment, I felt like I don't have the credentials or even the experience to present to any employer. Like I said, I came here at 20 years old. After 5 years, that's when I have decided to come back to school. But before I decided to go back to school, I was working at 7-Eleven in the neighborhood where we used to live, because I felt like it's necessary for me to engage with the American people, the Native American who were born here in the United States, and probably they can help me speak English better in terms of engaging. And I said, when I started that job, even before that, it took me 1 year to even get my social security number. So I wasn't able to work at that time. But as that progressed, got my undergrad in business, I was able to work for a small manufacturing company in the human resources. That didn't stop there. I faced racism there and felt the isolation, felt like I don't know what I'm doing, or they think that I don't know what I'm doing. I have so many questions in terms of, why do I feel like treated this way? I am here now. I'm able to do my work, but I still feel different. Still feel like I'm not included. And that's what forced me to go back to school. I said, I need more education. So I decided at this time, because I didn't really wanted to continue the business, I decided to pursue something that I really want. I applied for graduate school at George Mason University, and after 2 years, I attained my master's in forensic science. And then I have spent 3 months of internship at the United States Postal Inspection Service doing fingerprints. That's when the confidence came in. I felt like this is a completely different level for me. I felt so confident to myself that I feel like everybody who wants to communicate with me, I have an answer to say. I have an answer to give. It was an amazing experience and transformation in terms of just being who I am and what's inside of me. It completely changed me. And that is just unique for myself. And then after that, I told my husband, I think I want to start a business. I think I want to bring back the memories back home. And this is what I know. I really enjoyed working with my hands and the handcrafted part of it. So I decided to start the business in 2016 in July. And I wanted to make the candles. And I said, this time I wanted to be completely different. I wanted to share more about, not just because it's a candle, but I wanted to make more of a difference in terms of using natural ingredients. Um, so the business is focused into positivity of your own self. And I wanted to express that to everybody. Some of the candles would say it's health and spirituality. It's all about feeling good. And at the same time, I wanted to make a change for someone who would use it. I felt like it was really important to share that because especially for those who are feeling down and sad. I've been there. I'm feeling all that, and everybody can relate to that. So just being an immigrant and all of that I have faced throughout the years and 17 years of living here, I said maybe I could use this as a tool to really express who I am. And actually, this is the very first time that I am able to say this because not a lot of people might say that probably Jeff is not an immigrant. Maybe he was born here because with a lot of things that have changed so much with myself, there's some people who get confused. So where are you actually from? You sounded like you're from the Southern. I guess maybe because I'm trying so hard to change my accent so that they don't hear my Filipino accent and they hear something else. Maybe it's American. But then people would confuse like it is American, but you're in the South now.
Well, you did start out in Virginia, so.
Yeah, and then I would go backwards. So that was really good. And the business, it's really good. I felt accepted. I felt like I did something really good for myself to feel included. And when I go out there and present it, people would look at me in the eye, and I felt like I could look at their eyes too, and able to communicate. And I felt like I'm able to express what I've done and able to deliver that message, and they do understand it. So that's the best thing for me to be able to communicate and to connect with the native-born Americans. So now my American dream is the business, the American dream. I shared this with my family. I said I will be here today, and I would like to share this. My American dream is not because I opened a business, and I've been thinking about this. It is my citizenship. I've worked so hard for it because when I immigrated here, I felt like I don't have the rights. I can't get the benefits, just like any other American they're getting. But I am here now in the United States, and being a green card holder back then as a permanent resident, I still don't feel included because I don't have the right to vote. I don't have a say. I still feel like I'm an outsider. And it is my citizenship that actually made me feel more included in the United States. I felt like every time I'm seeing somebody, a native-born American would say that, hey, you can vote, and so am I. And I can do that now. So for me, that is my American dream.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
Tyler, I want to turn to you a little bit because this idea of achieving citizenship, being able to vote, that's always been a very important part of how immigrants sort of integrate into the United States. They vote, they run for office, they gain power. Can you talk a little bit about how different immigrant groups did that over our history?
Sure. Immigrants have always actually been important and even sometimes controversial in their acquiring citizenship, and especially in terms of voting. So you go all the way back to just the very beginning years of the United States, and no sooner do we win our independence from Great Britain than Americans start fighting with each other over the role immigrants play in politics. And in the presidency of John Adams, the second president of the United States, the Federalists, his supporters, worry that most of the immigrants are voting for Thomas Jefferson and his Party. And so the Federalists passed laws increasing the amount of time immigrants have to wait until they can vote from 5 years until 14 years. And so this is one of the first times in American history that immigrants become a presidential political issue. And Jefferson runs for the presidency in 1800 on a promise to repeal those laws, and they are indeed repealed. So, and this continues to be an issue throughout American history. So, for example, one of the things you hear a lot about these days with the 2020 presidential election is the often arcane and seemingly overly complicated voter registration laws. Those laws, we didn't have voter registration for the first 70 or 80 years of American history. They were only put in place in the late 1850s by the Republican Party when Republicans claimed that Irish immigrants were voting illegally before they had become citizens. And so the purpose of having voter registration was so that instead of determining one's eligibility on election day at the polls, you'd have where you would prove your eligibility in advance, and then that would give you the right to vote. Well, no sooner did that happen than the politicians came up with ways to overcome that and sometimes take advantage of that. And so then later in American history, immigrants continue to be kind of a presidential election issue. One thing that happened, so the process for Jeff to become a citizen was relatively complicated and expensive. Yet back 100 or 150 years ago, the political parties would have paid all of Jeff's expenses to become a citizen and filled out all the paperwork for him and found witnesses, if he didn't have any, who would swear to his eligibility and his lack of a criminal record in order to get him his citizenship in time to vote for the next election. So a process that now takes years, in those days took hours because politicians wanted to get as many voters as possible. The other aspect to your question is the relative interest in immigrants in the political process. So you have, Irish immigrants in the period of the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, very politically active. The other big immigrant group in that period, German immigrants, much less politically active, much less likely to vote. You get to the later period, the early 20th century, Eastern European Jewish immigrants, very politically active, very likely to vote. The other big immigrant group in that period are Italian immigrants, comparatively very politically apathetic, at least in terms of American politics. They still followed Italian politics and very unlikely to vote. And you have similar things today. Some groups like Latino immigrants, more likely to vote. Some groups, until recently anyway, like East Asian immigrants, less likely to vote, though that is changing to some extent now. So immigrants and presidential electoral politics have always been very much intertwined.
Rachel, I want to turn to you because there's a couple of different things that are round up here. One is the challenges of trying to find a job, going to school, starting a business. I'm sure Jeff can tell us all about all of the paperwork he had to fill out to start a business and permits and all of that kind of stuff. But those are things that localities run. This isn't about federal immigration policy. This is about what are the local laws and state laws and how do you register for school. This is exactly what your group works with, right? Helping local communities ease that pathway for immigrants. Talk to us a little bit about all of those sort of mechanics that you work on.
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, most of us think about immigration, we think about federal policies, but exactly as you're saying, so much of this is shaped at a local level. And that means that communities really have a lot of agency to make this all work better. And there's a variety of ways that happens. So one of the trends that we have been seeing supporting over the last several years has been the creation of an office within local government that is responsible for affairs related to immigrants, new Americans. In some cases, they have a broader mandate around equity with immigrants as part of that. But in any case, their role is really to try to reduce those barriers, whether it's to opening a business, accessing information, that in the case of COVID, for example, can really be life-saving. We just went through this big mobilization of getting information out to communities who, because of language, might not have otherwise gotten that information, or really had a voice in how emergency response was shaped. And so really looking across all of the interactions that local government has with people and that other institutions in a community have with people, and saying, how can we make this easier, more accessible? And I think the beauty of that is there's this idea of the curb cut effect, which, if you're not familiar with it, speaks to some of the design that was done in the Americans with Disabilities Act, where we cut curbs so that a wheelchair could go up, and yet when I come out there with my stroller, it's that much easier to get up. And so it's the idea that when we make something more accessible to some, we really make it more accessible to others. And some of the work that a lot of cities have done in looking at how to make their small businesses more to make that process easier for immigrant communities has really led to a rethinking of the permitting process, of how they get information out, which just makes it that much easier for anyone to open a business. And that's but one example of many, which is why I always say, the process of demographic change forces us to think about how we really design government to work for people, and in that reflection, I think solve a lot of issues that have been there all along. And then the other thing I'll say, just to put another point on this, I'm really thrilled that HIREC House is hosting this conversation. And I think one of the things we've also seen all over the country is that groups, that don't traditionally play a role on issues like immigration, are asking, what can we do as positive role models? What can we do to be more inclusive in the way that we tell the story of a community, in the way that we're reflective of a community. And I just think that makes for a better America. It makes for better products. It makes for more interesting culture. It's something that really lifts all of us up.
Thank you. Jeff, coming back to you, have you seen, since you started your business, are there other fellow immigrants from the Philippines or other places that now see you as that role model, as that, hey, you did it, help us, how do we do it?
It was very fascinating. The business has only been 4 years, but the HIREC House has been part of our business, and we are very grateful for them for allowing us to be part of it. And it feels amazing that the community actually help immigrants like me to even promote my business and to market my business, and they even help me and J Squared to actually be successful. What's really interesting is we've traveled, around the DMV area running our business, and I have met a lot of Filipinos, and what's really funny is they always say, "Are you Filipino?" And yes, I am. And then as soon as you say that, yes, I am Filipino, and then everybody would start talking in the native language as if it's some sort of a comfort way of connecting, even though I don't know them, I don't have any connections with them, but there's something about it. They always say, it's like, this is your business. They're always surprised about how I started the business. And in my thinking about it, it says, yes, I have started the business. It's not easy. It took a lot of time. I can't really speak for other immigrants who started the business if you are not a U.S. citizen. I don't know what are the paperwork or what are the requirements, but for me, it was just natural flow. I think what everybody was going through in terms of applying for a small business even permit. I didn't feel like I was having a hard time getting the documents that I need because I was a U.S. citizen already. So I'm not sure in terms of how about those permanent residents or for those immigrants who has a green card holder, what are the process they go through? But for me, it was just a very easy process. I was able to obtain all the documents that I needed and provide all the documentations that they need from me.
Sorry about that. So I'm going to take one of the questions that has come in online, and I'm going to direct this to Tyler. It's a question about how has the American dream changed over time, and whether or not you think it has. I mean, from your study of past immigrant groups, do you think they see the American dream very differently today, especially listening to what Jeff had to say?
No, I think the American dream has really not changed at all. That immigrants and even natives, for that matter, see the United States as a place that uniquely allows them to achieve their dreams of financial success, upward mobility, and freedom. And it's not to say that the United States is the only place that one can achieve those things, but for a variety of reasons, immigrants all over the world see the United States as the place where those things are both easiest to achieve and most likely to be successfully achieved. And that was the case. That's how people wrote about the United States back in the 16 and 1700s. So, going all the way back to the time when the English were the main immigrant group coming to the United States. The poorest English people, servants and so forth, thought, well, if I go to the United States, I work as a servant a few years, then I can save enough money to buy a farm, be independent, not be in this position of servitude. Or if I can't achieve that, then at least my children will have a much better chance of being independent and being better off than I was. And that's the kind of thing that people see as being possible in the United States to an extent that they don't see really in virtually any other part of the world. And that view hasn't changed over the course of the centuries. The United States has remained a place where people see that as possible. And I think that's in part because, Jeff is a great example of entrepreneurship and the ways in which people see entrepreneurship as especially likely to succeed in the United States. They see the United States as a place with very lightly drawn social or socioeconomic classes, that it's easier to move between classes in the United States than elsewhere. Now, the economic data doesn't always bear that out in the United States as it once did, but still immigrants perceive it that way. And so throughout time, whether you look at the 1600s or the 2000s, immigrants around the world see the United States as the number one place to achieve those kinds of dreams.
Yeah. Rachel, one of our other questions is, are there changes to the immigration system that could make integration easier? We've had a lot of conversations over the last decade about how to reform our immigration system. A lot of that's about how we determine which immigrants get to come in, but do you think it's the system, or do you think it's what we do after that is most integral to integration?
Well, I think that the answer is it's a little bit of both, but all of it flows from what I think is this very fundamental question, again, that we're reckoning with in this moment, which is, are we and will we be an America in which you can call yourself an American regardless of your race, creed, country of origin? And we've been in a period of increasing immigration restriction, but both in terms of laws, but also in terms of the narrative, and really, a concerted effort to narrow who can call themselves an American. And I think until we really answer that question definitively, affirmatively, and make that decision as a country, all of our immigration laws really flow from that. I think then once we do so, and my hope remains that we will, affirm that to be an American, any of us can call ourselves American regardless of our identity, and we can create, a system of immigration that is based on that principle. then I think at a federal level, at least, we can reinforce the work that happens in communities with resources and support, as some of our peers do in places like New Zealand, where the federal government is investing resources into actually building welcoming communities, and so that when people arrive, we can really make sure that that they're successful and that their communities are successful. And I think an immigration system that really recognizes our own country's self-interest in doing that, especially for parts of our country that have been seeing a big loss in population, places like Detroit, large parts of Ohio, who really need people to to power their economies, and investing in people who are both already there and who could come there is going to be essential for their economic growth and for the economic growth of our country.
Jeff, let me ask you, based on your experience, the immigration experience, the citizenship experience, what would have made your process easier, do you think? Or what help would you have liked to have received that maybe you feel like you didn't?
I think it's more of the timeline in terms of the wait, applying for the citizenship, because you're, as an immigrant, you're always like thinking, what's happening with my application? I am not seeing anything else. You're getting a receipt number and you check, it's still the same. And it took a lot of
Can I ask
patience
how
actually to
from the time?
Sure.
Can I ask just how long did it take from the time you filed to the time you were approved?
I can't remember. It was back in May 2010, but I think I have waited for a few months before I heard from them, and to just the process of like getting scheduled for fingerprints, interview, and to study. I am not sure how long that actually took, but I think it's a few months.
Yeah, but it felt like a really long time to you.
It felt like a very long time, because coming to United States without your permanent resident yet, or your green card holder, your green card, you felt like that is just, it felt like years. It felt like it's just a very long process. And then as soon as you get your green card, you would think that it will be a lot easier to apply for a U.S. citizen after meeting the requirements of living here for 5 years without returning home. And that's what I did. I did not return home. My goal was to live here for straight 5 years, apply for citizenship, and get my citizenship. So the permanent resident, you would think that you have all of the documentations, and the immigration would have all of in their system and the copy. But then applying for this U.S. citizen, it seems like you're starting over again. That's what it feels like, for how long you have to wait and for all the documents that you have to provide all over again. So yeah, it took a while.
It took a while. Rachel, I want to come back to you real quick. There's the process of applying for all of the legal documents that people need. But the idea that, like you said, so much happens in communities. We don't have federal policy on integration, really. We sort of expect immigrants like Jeff, who arrive like, here, you're here, great, yay, go do it. Like, what do you think is missing? What do you think is needed? Do you think we need more federal involvement in this? Or do you think the process that we have with states and localities and immigrants themselves and their own communities, this sort of mishmash of different entities, is enough?
Sorry, sparing you all from the screams of my children. the role that the
we
federal
are all
government...
doing this from home, in case anybody didn't realize that. It's
okay. Though we wish we could be in person having a beer at the house.
Absolutely.
And hope that day will come soon. I think the federal government and really this work began during the Obama years of the federal government thinking about a more active role that it could play in supporting the efforts of states and localities. So really not a kind of top-down approach, but a bottom-up one, because the context of every community is different, and what every community needs to do to not only support immigrants but really bridge some of these divides looks a little bit different depending on whether you're a big city or a small town in Nebraska. But I think the federal government's role can be about providing resources to communities to build their own infrastructure, to help more people naturalize, to help more people open their business, to make sure that kids come to school and don't get bullied there. All the things that are really inherently local work. And at a federal level, I think there's an opportunity to do some of what we've seen happen within city governments, which is to have an office that really supports that work, but also looks inward into government and says, what is every agency doing here to create its own inclusive environment, to make sure that it is reflective of the community, and really, supporting work that is reflective of the country that we are today.
Yeah, Tyler, historically,
can I add something into this?
Yes, I was just going to call on you. Go ahead.
Sure. I was just going to say that from a historical perspective, I think there's two things that come to mind. One is that one thing the federal government can definitely do is return to the era when it was easier to become a citizen. Because, one of the few clear things that the data and the studies show is that citizens integrate more readily than non-citizens. And yet we've put up so many barriers to citizenship that it's become either too difficult or too expensive for so many people. You have to hire a lawyer now and spend a lot of money on that, and that's a relatively new thing. And so that's one thing. And on the other hand, other than making it easier to become a citizen, I think that one thing history shows is that the best thing that government can do is stay out of the integration process, because when government has gotten into it, it's always been in a very ham-handed way with, teaching about Betsy Ross and things like that. And it's always way behind what really immigrants need to assimilate. And so immigrants want to integrate. They want to become a bit bigger part of the American fabric. And really what happens is Americans more stand in the way of that than anything else. And so other than helping with citizenship, I think the best thing we can do is stay out of the way and let it happen the way it always has. And we'll always underestimate how much it's happening, but we need to be confident that it is happening.
Yeah. Jeff, a question has come in asking do you know how long your original sponsorship to come to the USA took before you arrived and got your green card? How long were you waiting in that process, even before to come?
Yeah. So my mother was remarried to American, and she was supposed to come to US alone. But then I think it was brought to her attention that if she has children, she can take them with her. But at that time, I was under 21 years old. And I believe that one of the immigration officers or a lawyer was telling my stepfather that my mother can take me with her going to the United States because I was still under 21 years old. So that's when I found out that the immigration basically has a different way of bringing people here in terms of, the children and my mother. But that actually just took about 2 years for us as I think it was the fiancé visa for my mother. And they call it as a derivative visa for me.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it took about 2 years for us. It happened really fast.
And that's very fast for a lot of people,
really
particularly
fast.
A lot of your country folk who wait in very long lines to come to the United States.
Can I add one more thing about this?
Yeah, please.
in terms of the waiting, I'm just gonna share the story of my sister. My eldest sister is still in the Philippines. My second sister is now living in Florida, and my mom also. But my eldest sister is still live in the Philippines. My She was married when she was 19, and unfortunately, her husband passed away after 2 months of marriage. She never got remarried again because the parents of my brother-in-law adopted my sister, and my brother-in-law's parents are actually living at that time in New Mexico, and they were all U.S. citizens already. So basically, they went into the process of adopting my sister, and then they put a petition to my sister to come to America. So talking about long period of time, that took 16 years before my sister heard from the
16 years.
immigration. Right. And then my sister then went to the immigration, the U.S. Embassy in the Philippines for her very first interview. So 19 plus 16 years. So she's a little older now. But went to the interview. After just 2 minutes, the immigration officer that she doesn't have any relationship with the father-in-law, despite of it, the legal adoption process of what happened to her. So in just 2 minutes, everything just went to garbage for that way. And unfortunately, the parents, the father actually passed away, who's actually
no one to sponsor her,
trying to take her. So so everything went downhill from there. So in terms of the length and weight, it's just completely different in terms of what type of visa you are being sponsored to.
Yeah, it's a challenge for everybody just to get here, and then the integration challenges after you arrive just add to all of that.
Yeah.
Rachel, I want to come back to you. Someone asked a question, and you mentioned a little bit about COVID and the impact on immigrant communities. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, for a process that involves meeting and talking with people, basically at every stage to feel like you're integrating, how has COVID impacted that for immigrants?
Well, I think we know that immigrant communities, have been some of the communities hardest hit by COVID, and there's a lot of reasons for that that are related to immigrants being disproportionately represented in our workforce, in communities that don't have access to good healthcare systems, and I think a community's capacity to really support people and make sure that they had ready access to information also played into that, which is why one of the things we've been doing is really focusing on helping people develop more inclusive emergency response systems as a whole. Because whether it's COVID or the next fire or earthquake, we operate as a community, and so making sure that everybody is really part of that and part of the solution to whatever crisis is next is really vital. I think, the other impact of COVID, as you're alluding to, is that coming together in person to really see one another as neighbors is both made harder, but I think also people have realized in this moment how important that is, and how important it is for us to be able to depend on one another. And these sort of artificial boundaries of us, them, on the basis of, immigration status, race, who we love. I mean, these are all false borders. And the place where we cross them is really in communities. And so one of the other things that we've been, really supporting and amplifying and seeing throughout our network is, these really neighborhood level efforts to bring people together to find a sense of neighborliness in one another, whether that's to build a playground together, or to create, a community beautification project, or, literally to feed people right now. And I think, whether you care about this issue through the lens of immigration or just democracy, that is a healthy thing for our society to be doing. That's going to make us that much more resilient to whatever comes our way, is really to build that trust and those relationships at a community level. So I'm encouraged by that. I hope we see more of that. And I mean, we exist to support that. And, it's something that I hope will only proliferate after we get through this.
Yeah. Tyler, I want to talk to you a little bit historical here. I mean, there have been we've had pandemics before in the United States. We've had different tragedies that have impacted different groups. I'm thinking about New Yorkers and 9/11 and the aftermath of 9/11. That happened to like 110 countries or more represented in the towers, and the communities that had to come together after that. But there's a history there in New York of New Yorkers kind of helping each other can you talk a little bit about from, I think about the fire at the garment factory that impacted immigrants. The pandemic in 1918, I'm sure was just like now, probably hit immigrant communities very hard. What's been the historical sort of significance of that ability of a community to come together to help each other for immigrants and for natives in those kind of situations?
Well, what you've had in these situations is kind of both a coming together and also sometimes a breaking apart. So if you look at 9/11, you had lots of people coming together to support the victims of the terrorist attacks, and especially and especially those in immigrant communities. Yet at the same time, you had a big backlash against Muslim immigrants because they were perceived, they were connected with the terrorists. The terrorists weren't immigrants, but still Americans associated the terrorists with foreign-born, and therefore immigrants suffered as a result. When you go back to the flu pandemic of 1918 and 1919, there's a couple of parallels. One, of course, the flu didn't discriminate between native-born and immigrants. On the other hand, the native-born were more likely, like today, to have the means to escape to other places, away from the density that often was bringing about the passing of the flu virus. And so just like today, immigrants suffered in big cities. Immigrants suffered disproportionately from the pandemic. The case that actually most comes to mind is the cholera outbreaks of the 19th century. So cholera is a bacterial disease that was spread by contaminated water. And bacteria, the cholera was something that hit immigrant neighborhoods hardest. Yet at the same time, because a lot of those immigrants who would get cholera would then, for their day jobs, go work in the homes of the native-born, especially Irish immigrant women working as domestic servants. It spread that way to native-born, well-to-do homes. And so just as is the case during other disease outbreaks, often immigrants are scapegoated as being the causes. And then, of course, one of the famous examples was Typhoid Mary, who was an Irish immigrant who helped spread typhoid through New York through her work as a domestic servant in the late 19th century. So there's always been this connection, and there's always been the blaming of immigrants, and there's always been a disproportionate impact on immigrant communities.
But going back to what Rachel said, helping the immigrants helps everyone, right? Like it's, as you said, like you can't separate the communities. You can't separate people that way, especially when you have an incident like this. I just want to remind our viewers, we have a few minutes left. If you have some questions you haven't gotten in, don't forget to enter them on the comment section of YouTube or Facebook, or tweet at us with the hashtag BPC Live, or hashtag Once Upon American Dream. Jeff, coming back to you, I'm going to ask sort of the question that started all of this. It's, how do immigrants become us? Our motto is E Pluribus Unum, which is out of many one. Do you feel American now? Do you feel like you've finally become one of us?
I do. It feels amazing, and like I said, the transformation was just amazing to me. Going back to where I started, I thought like, wow, there's no way I'm going to be American if I don't change myself in a way that I have to adapt. But for me, I feel more American now. I feel like I'm able to do things just like any other Americans. I'm able to vote. I'm able to exercise my rights. I'm able to get the benefits that I needed to help me as an individual, as an American. Um, but yeah, you really have to force yourself to make those changes, and then it's all really up to the person and on how they want to live here. There's a lot at stake, but at the same time, there's a lot of good and beautiful things that can happen to you as an immigrant.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Tyler, back to you. What do you think is the story of immigrant integration in America?
Well, I think the story of integration of immigrant integration in America is one that is it's one that kind of the more things change, the more they stay the same. So on the one hand, you know, how Americans define being an American has changed over time. Right. So in the 17th and 18th and most of the 19th century, it meant to most native-born Americans being a Protestant, being what today we'd call a WASP. But that's changed over time. Then people started looking at it as more, well, you can be not Protestant so long as you're Christian. And then, well, you don't necessarily have to be Christian as long as you're part of the Judeo-Christian ethic. And so, you know, it keeps changing. And the definition of what it means to be an American in that sense is going to keep changing. On the other hand, what's stayed the same is kind of the values that Americans look for in their citizens. They're looking for things like, you know, that Jeff exemplifies really, you know, hard work, stick-to-itiveness, dedication to the ideals that America stands for. And so in that way, the idea of immigrant integration really doesn't change that much over time. And then finally, the other thing that doesn't change is that native-born Americans are always skeptical of immigrants' ability to integrate. They're skeptical of the idea that immigrants can become part of the American fabric, even though their own immigrant forebears, suffered from that same skepticism. And so each group looks back at each group's children look at the newest immigrants and think, well, they're not at all like my immigrant parents. And so that's almost as much of being an American as anything else is this skepticism of immigration. And yet in the end, we've proven time and again, despite crisis after crisis, that immigrants are part of what makes America great. And so it's the kind of thing that most Americans are very dedicated to. And Americans are often surprised when I point out that the acceptance of immigrants, according to polling, acceptance of immigrants right now is at an all-time high. And so a lot of people think, well, perhaps President Trump has dimmed Americans' views towards immigrants. But in fact, the opposite has happened. And during the Trump presidency, the rate at which Americans see immigrants as a good thing is at an all-time high. And so in that way, that gives me confidence that the role that immigrants play as a really defining part of American history will continue.
Rachel, your organization is called Welcoming America. Where do you feel we are right now? And when you work with these various communities, do you feel like America is becoming more welcoming, like Tyler said?
It's a great question. Well, one thing I've just been reflecting on, maybe just seeing it flash up on the screen in Tyler's book is the image of the Statue of Liberty. And a lot of people don't know this, but the Statue of Liberty was actually created, and Tyler, I'm sure, could speak about this more eloquently, but it was created really as a symbol of at the end of slavery in the United States, to mark that moment as a moment of liberation. And yet, by the time it was actually created, there was a lot of skepticism about whether America really was a place of freedom. This is the middle of the Reconstruction period, and rights were being taken away and really constricted for Black Americans. And I think America has always sort of existed in that space of this, these grand aspirations for what we can be, and then this really troubling reality, which I think a lot of us are feeling today. And I just come back to the sense of possibility that exists when you look at what communities are capable of in really spanning that gap, and showing how we can really become the successful multiracial democracy that I think we were meant to be, and that is so embodied in that image of the Statue of Liberty. And I can say, with a lot of confidence, working with about 200 communities here in the U.S. and actually another half dozen or so around the world, that there are leaders everywhere in every corner of this country and this globe who really believe in that ideal, who are working really hard to bring it about, and honestly, who need the support of people who are sort of on the sidelines now and who believe that that's a value that's important. We need your help. We need your help to really bring that vision of a welcoming America about. So just, thank you again for this opportunity to talk a little bit more about that.
Well, thank you all for being here, and I want to give everybody a chance to plug your own things. So, Jeff, starting with you, if people want to support J Squared and your company, where can they find your products? Where can they find you online?
Sure. Our website is jsquarednaturals.com. So we are operating 100% e-commerce at the moment because of COVID. So all of our market has been canceled. So if you want to learn more about J Squared, please visit our website, on our Instagram at jsquarednat. So learn more from us and how we started the business, and yeah, we'll see you there. If you guys have any questions, email us, and we will get back to you as soon as we can.
Thank you, Jeff, for being here. Rachel, if people want to join Welcoming America, Rachel, where do they find Welcoming America information?
You can find us, welcomingamerica.org is our website. We're also on all the social media platforms, Welcoming USA on Twitter. Please connect with us.
Sure. And Tyler, if people want to find your books, and you have another book upcoming, where do they find that?
You can find my books anywhere, Amazon, your local independent bookstore, hopefully. But all the big book retailers have them, and there's not only the print editions, but there's audio versions and ebook versions too. So they're easy to come by.
Great. And if you want to learn more about the Bipartisan Policy Center, you can find us at bipartisanpolicy.org. I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank our partners at Hyrick House and turn it over to Kim Bender to say goodbye for us.
Thank you so much, our amazing panelists, Tyler, Rachel, and Jeff. Thank you to our amazing moderator, as usual, Teresa. And thank you all for joining us and helping with the conversation through your questions and comments. Please subscribe to the Bipartisan Policy Center's YouTube channel for notifications on upcoming live events and more BPC video content. And follow at Hyrick House, that's HEURICH, and at BPC_bipartisan on social media to learn more about both of our organizations. And we'll see you back soon.